I want to talk about compassion today. You see, when you think about the debates around abortion, and particularly the recent debate about decriminalising abortion for the mother, and you think about the debate about the end of life, the question of compassion and what is compassionate comes up time and time again. Last week, I came under some attack for talking about how we respond when some of these votes go against us. And I suggested that we need to be careful with some of the language that we use when it becomes hyperbolic, when we use hyperbole, because of how that might be picked up and how that might be heard. And the kind of attack that I came under was to say that by suggesting we should think carefully about our language and think about its impact and think about the people involved, that I was accusing anybody who used language I disagreed with of lacking compassion or not showing compassion. Actually, I wasn't doing that at all. There was nothing to do with that, although there is a risk that we can be heard as speaking or acting, seem to be acting without compassion. And I think there are times and situations when Christians have spoken and acted where it's been difficult to see compassion on display. But that wasn't my point at the time. My point was simply that we have to think about how we speak and how we act. We need to think about our audiences and how they hear us, and we need to think about what we are going to do and say that will be effective. But within that conversation, I picked up on the point that sometimes we're very quick to react and talk about the motives of those that are promoting assisted dying and promoting not so much abortion itself, although that's a thing, but promoting the decriminalisation of abortion for the mothers. Some recent articles have basically said this is all about human autonomy. This is about idolatry. And this is about selfishness and greed and callousness. Now, to be clear, underpinning the original 1967 Abortion Act, underpinning the question of euthanasia, is this big question about human autonomy. Do I have control over my body and who and what I carry in my body? Do I have control over when and how I die? So that autonomy question is important. And then I've seen some shocking commentary. In fact, long before other people were worrying that there was a danger of assisted dying, of assisted killing, of euthanasia coming into force here in England, I was picking up and warning about the shift in the debate where authors, I think Matthew Parris was one of the first guys to do this in the time, were openly arguing that people should be put under pressure to consider taking their own lives when they are, not just when they're terminally ill, but when they become old and frail, because the impact to the economy would be huge, that they were a burden on the economy, they cost money, and so euthanasia will save money. And in fact, we are now seeing reports of calculations about what possible cost savings there might be if we don't have to provide palliative care, if we don't have to wait for people to free up hospital beds, if we're not paying for medication and pain relief and that kind of thing. And that callousness is real. I have talked previously about how the 1967 Abortion Act was not really a great victory for women, for feminism, for their autonomy, their control over their body, but was primarily about rich and powerful men making sure that women could be available and productive economically. And that's a fact we've never really talked about, how under the guise of feminism, actually there's been things that have been really not about giving women freedom and choice, but about making them more economically useful. And so those things are real issues. But I think we can say that without denying that for some people there is a real issue of wanting to be compassionate, wanting to care for others. And so that means that when we look at the concern to decriminalise, you look at the reasons given, some of the scenarios that come up, there'd be a recognition that there are women who have been investigated by the police, taken to court, prosecuted, in some cases found guilty and served with prison sentences, in quite a few of the cases actually not been found guilty at that stage, so having had to go through the whole criminal investigation and prosecution. And there's an argument, first, that for quite a few of those women, there were huge mitigating factors. In at least one case, that actually they were investigated for something that was nothing to do with abortion at all, but they were actually, they had a stillbirth. And when they went for medical help, that got reported to the police as a suspected late-term self-administered abortion. And that's tragic. Now that that person had the added suffering, the added burden, the added grief of them being subject to a police investigation, of being accused of something that they'd not done. It's certainly something that we would not want to happen. It's something that should grieve us. That is a horrendous injustice, isn't it? And then you've got others, and you would say, well, here are the mitigating factors. The young girl who's been sexually abused, molested, the rape victim. The parents that are really struggling with what the impact of bringing a child into the world with huge disabilities, that child is going to suffer significantly. And whilst we may have a view on what is right and wrong there, and whilst I would be saying, look, I think in terms of what God's word says, we shouldn't be making a judgment call to say that life isn't worth bringing into the world. We can at least understand the pain that that person's gone through. And then there are others where you would say, I'm not sure there are mitigating factors. So one of the cases that's been used as an example is a mum that didn't want to have children at all. She just didn't want a child, and so she arranged for a home abortion kit, mistakenly believing that she was within the time frame for having an abortion. I realised when the baby was stillborn, after taking that poison, that she was much further along in her pregnancy than she'd realised. And I want to be very careful about seeing that in terms of mitigation, because that was a deliberate choice to end a life. I guess we might factor in and think about how that person's been misled in terms of how they view human life before birth, about how the culture around them has taught them to think that this is just about autonomy over their own body and not that they are killing a precious life made in the image of God. But we might also want to think about the effect that abortion has physically and emotionally, the guilt, the shame that those that have had abortions carry, the PTSD that they live with. We might want to think about where you have a mum that has other children that are being separated from them and sent to prison. And so even in those cases, we might be saying that there's an argument for compassion here. And so one of the things I've wanted to argue is this, that we can look and we can see compassionate concern for those people. Similarly, at the end of life, one of the drivers for the assisted dying act has been all of the stories, all of the experience of people that have gone through horrendous suffering at the end of their life and the effect that's had on their families. And so there can be a real driver in terms of compassion and mercy, not wanting people to have to go through that, not wanting families to have to go through that. And so I think we can understand those compassionate motives as well as having compassion ourselves. And there's nothing wrong, there's no risk with us as Christians having that understanding and recognising compassion when we see it around us. And that's part of our understanding of the doctrine of humanity and the doctrine of sin. Because as someone who's reformed in my theology, I believe that we are all sinners. I believe that our sin means that we are fallen, so that sin and evil affects all aspects of our lives. We refer to that as total depravity. But the doctrine of total depravity has never meant that a person is just so contaminated with evil that there is no sense of goodness, that there isn't the possibility that they can have good emotions and good desires or do good and right acts. There's a sense in which, because the underlying idolatrous sin in us means that even those good deeds are not good because they are directed towards the wrong end. But there's also that tension of saying that actually fallen sinners can be compassionate. Fallen sinners can be loving and caring. Fallen sinners can be kind and seek to do good to others. So we've got no problem with recognising that. But we've also got no problem with recognising that because we can also say that just because someone has compassionate motives and just because someone is trying to act out of compassion, that doesn't mean to say that the things that they end up saying and doing are truly compassionate. And so it's possible both to recognise those compassionate motives and to say that what you are doing is not compassionate. It's the opposite of it. And that way, by recognising the motives, recognising the intent, enables us to show why, to give an answer to show this is why this is not compassionate. And it also helps us to think about what might be better ways of responding, what might be better solutions to the problems that they identify. Now, let's just highlight in both those cases what that might be. So, when you think about assisted dying, that is why I think we need in our compassionate response to emphasise that the big need is better end-of-life care, better medical care, better palliative care. But also we need to help people get a better sense, a better understanding of suffering and how to face it and how to walk through it. And I'm just giving you a couple of very short sentences here that really are worthy of a lot of unpacking and a lot of thinking through, but just to get us thinking about these things. And in terms of the first one, in terms of the decriminalisation of abortion for mothers in regards to their own pregnancy, I think it is not unreasonable to say that there are a number of cases where, without denying the evil of abortion and without denying that that person has done wrong themselves, and we may identify mitigating circumstances, but we still recognise wrong. I would say that I recognise that there are cases where prosecution and prison may not be the right response. I have highlighted in an article I find on Faith Groups why I wouldn't have gone down the decriminalisation route. Because of all of the knock-on impacts that has. I think in this particular case, what we are responding to is another problem that was created. So back during the pandemic, when there was lots of self-isolation, when you couldn't get into hospital for routine and elective procedures, there was this major concern about what would happen in the case of abortion. And because those seeking abortions wouldn't be able to go to hospitals or clinics easily. And so self-administered abortion kits were made available from pharmacies, or even delivered to your home. You and I might have, will have huge issues with that even as a solution at that time, but that was what happened. but they were meant to be limited. That there was even shorter than the current restriction of 24 weeks about when you could administer at home. Not least because those self-administered kits, as you get further into the pregnancy, create a greater risk to the mother herself, and so there were tight limits on it. But of course, there wasn't really any way of checking and confirming how far someone was in their pregnancy. So someone could lie about it, and somebody could be mistaken about it, and no one would know. But whatever we think about it, and I don't think those kits should have ever been introduced. Even if you do think, okay, I can see why they were introduced at the time. The big problem that we've got now is that they continue to be provided after the pandemic, when that reason was no longer in place. So it was possible for somebody to self-administer abortion, in effect having their own backstreet abortion, but without having to go to a hospital or a clinic. The very thing that the Abortion Act had been put in place to deal with backstreet illegal abortions became readily possible again. And whilst abortion was still illegal, still criminal after 24 weeks, there was no way to check on that until after the event. And so just as with those backstreet illegal abortions administered by others, the way that those things tended to come up was and is when something goes wrong, when the mum is taken unwell and has to get medical help. And so what this law has done is effectively, what it will do, is it has said that it is possible, it is legal for your local pharmacy to run those backstreet abortions up until birth. And by the way, I do think that's grievous. I do think that that is something that we would describe as an evil, properly understood, properly framework, not as a hyperbolic, absolute, pure evil headline, but properly framed and understand. I don't want to say that. Can you see how grievous and evil that is? Not because of the intent of people, but because of what it does, because of the impact it has. And that should help us to think about what might be the right solution here. I think the right solution is to put the responsibility back with those providing the jugs. Yes, the mother might take them herself, but actually someone else has prescribed, made them available to her. Just as, she might take a tablet and put it in her own mouth, sat in a hospital clinic. Well, she might do that at home. But you wouldn't say that if she'd had an abortion by taking some pills or an injection and she'd administered it herself in the clinic, you wouldn't say that that was a self-administered abortion. You would still say someone else has administered it. Here we are really talking about remote administered abortions. So what do? Well, we go after the prescribers. And we say it is their responsibility to make sure that what they are doing is within the law, that they aren't enabling something that is criminal and wrong. Of course, the challenge is, but how could they actually know? How could they actually be certain in terms of those self-administered drugs? I mean, I guess you could insist that it has to be prescribed and verified through the GP, through a one-to-one consultation as best as possible, so that the responsibility lies there. But even that doesn't feel good enough for me. I think the simple answer is this, that it was a horrendous mistake. It was an evil, it was a sin to introduce these self-administered abortion, these self-administered killing kits. And what we should do is make them illegal and stop that from happening. And that's got to be the compassionate thing to do, hasn't it? That we're not putting women at risk, that we're not putting them into a dangerous position, and that we're not providing the resources that bring death to these young lives. We can recognise the compassionate motives of others whilst also recognising that what they do is not in the end compassionate. We can recognise the evil in things without resorting to hyperbole. We can offer better, compassionate solutions to human suffering without facilitating sin.